Hey everyone, it's Mark with Create and Kaptivate, and I'm here again with my Mini 4 Pro. And this is kind of a follow-up to my last video where I went through all of the information and settings available from the main screen on the controller. But I didn't go through any of the menu settings, so in this video I'm going to be going through everything in the main settings. And there's a whole lot to go through, so I'm not going to waste any time and we're going to jump right into it. Alright, I'm going to start by jumping right into the main settings menu. And to do that, I'll tap on the three dots in the upper right corner. This takes me into the main settings, and in here there are 5 tabs to select from. The first one is safety, so let's start there. So the first setting is obstacle avoidance, and you have the choice between bypass, brake, and off. The first thing I want to show is if I change it to off, now the obstacle avoidance is disabled, and if I go back to the camera view, the vision assist icons are red, and if I tap on them, they show unavailable. Now, if I select brake, that will enable the obstacle avoidance, and if I go back to the camera view, the vision assist icons are now white, and if I tap on them, the status now says normal. But if I change the mode switch on the controller to sport mode, you will see the icons once again turn red, and the status is back to unavailable. And by switching it back to either normal or cine mode, the obstacle avoidance is turned on and the icons turn white. So now I'm going to go back into the settings and switch the obstacle avoidance to off. And then if I start flying towards this little climbing wall, I will still get the obstacle avoidance indicators, but the drone won't stop from crashing into the wall unless I stop pushing forward on the control stick. So I'll just fly back a bit to get away from the wall, and I'll go back into the settings, and now I'll switch it to brake. So now if I fly towards the wall, the drone stops once it gets close. Even if I push all the way forward on the control stick, it moves slightly closer, but then completely stops moving forward. Now I'm just going to back the drone up once again, and then I'll go back into the settings, and now I'm going to change it to bypass. And you'll see when I select bypass, these bypassing options appear, which gives me the choice between normal or nifty. Since normal is selected, I'll demonstrate it first. So now if I fly towards the wall, the drone will bypass the obstacle, and in normal mode the drone will keep a greater distance from obstacles than it would in nifty mode. So now I'll back the drone up, and I'll go back into the settings and switch the bypassing option to nifty. You get a warning when doing this, basically saying there's an increased risk of collision, so use caution. I can just OK that. And now when I fly towards the wall, the drone will get closer before starting to bypass, and it's closer to the wall as it passes over top of it. Alright, there are a few more things that I want to show with the obstacle avoidance. So first, I'll bring the drone back, and then I'm going to switch the bypassing option back to normal. And for these next few demonstrations, I'm going to change the obstacle avoidance to brake. Now I'm going to open the map in the lower left corner, and then I'm going to switch to the attitude indicator. I can do that by tapping on the lower right corner or swiping left on the map. And now if you look at the attitude indicator, those orange spots are the obstacles identified by the vision assist. And now if I fly towards the wall, you'll see a red indication appear on the display in front of the drone. Now if I back away from the wall and then rotate the drone so the wall is now beside it, if I move sideways towards the wall, you can see the red indication appear beside the drone. You'll also notice the obstacle radar map, or the curved lines on the screen, also indicates the obstacle and the direction it is in. Now I'll rotate the drone to face the wall again, and then I'm going to switch to the vision assist display. And now you'll see as I fly toward the wall, the vision assist display will highlight in yellow when the drone gets close to an obstacle, and then turns red when it gets really close. The last thing I have to show for the obstacle avoidance is back in the settings menu, and it's this display radar map. Currently it's enabled, but if I disable it, I still have all my other obstacle indicators, but the radar map or those curved lines are no longer displayed. Now I'm going to turn the radar display back on, and I just wanted to show you as I rotate the drone next to the wall, the radar display will kind of rotate around the screen, indicating the direction of the obstacle. And that's all for the obstacle avoidance. Now I want to take a look at the next settings, and those are the return to home options. The first one, Advanced Return to Home, has two selections, Optimal and Preset. If you select Preset, you'll also want to adjust the Auto Return to Home altitude, which is right below it. Now, you'll want to set this higher than any obstacles in the area, as the drone will rise up to that altitude before returning home. So, to demonstrate these, I'm going to get the drone a bit higher up and adjust the gimbal so I can see the home point. And now, with the Advanced Return to Home set to preset, if I initiate a return to home, the drone will first fly up to the preset altitude before proceeding toward the home point. This may not be ideal if the drone is returning to home on a low battery, because this may waste valuable battery life. Anyway, I'm going to cancel that by tapping on this red circle with the X. And then I'm going to reposition the drone and gimbal and lower it down a ways. Now I'll go back into the settings and change the Advanced Return to Home to Optimal. And now if I initiate a return to home, provided there's adequate lighting, the drone will fly an optimal route home. Alright, while I'm up here, I want to go through the AR settings. So I'll cancel the return to home, and I'll just back the drone up so I can see the home point again. Now if I go back into the settings, the next one is Update Home Point, but I'm going to skip over that and I'll come back to it. So if I select AR settings, it brings up a few options for turning on and off the different AR displays. And that's why I wanted to be able to see the home point, because the first option is Show AR Home Point. And with it turned on, I get the home point indicated by the yellow H. But if I go back into the settings and turn it off, the home point AR display is gone. So if you're not seeing the home point, check these settings. Alright, I'll turn that back on, and the next option is Show AR Return to Home Route. This is for that green route indicator that appears on the screen when a return to home is initiated. So if I turn it off and initiate a return to home, I don't have that indication showing me the return to home path, which is really handy for monitoring the drone as it returns, making sure it's headed in the right direction and that there are no obstructions in its path. So I'll turn that back on, and now I'll actually get the drone to come in for a landing. And this may be a bit tricky because there are a bunch of trees and branches with no leaves. But I need to get it close to the ground to show the last AR display, which is the drone shadow. Well, it looks like it made it. And now as it gets closer to the ground, you can see the drone shadow displayed below the drone. This makes it really easy for lining up the drone for precise landings. Obviously, I wouldn't want to land it in the snow, but I can easily line it up with the landing pad using this AR display. So once again, if you're not seeing the drone shadow displayed on the screen, it may be turned off in the AR settings, just like this. And that's the AR displays and where you can go to turn them on and off. The next setting is max altitude, and I typically leave this at 120 meters or 400 feet, as in most places, that's the maximum altitude limit. Now, I'm able to adjust mine up to 500 meters, and if I do, I get this warning telling me basically what I just said about the altitude restriction. You can agree to keep the change, but I don't want to, so I'll just cancel out of here. The next setting is max distance, and I always have this set at no limit, but you can adjust it, and then if you reach the max distance, the drone will stop from flying any further away. The next two are sensor calibrations. If you wanted to calibrate these, you could do it from here, but the system lets you know when sensors require calibration, and you can typically do it right from the notification, so I haven't had to use these. Now below those is the battery info, and by selecting it, you get a bunch of information on the battery. First, you have the individual cell voltages. You just want to see that these are fairly balanced. To the right of those, you have total battery voltage and battery temperature. This is the one I use most often. When flying in either colder or warmer temperatures, you may want to monitor the battery temperature to ensure it's not getting too low or too high. Now, the system does give battery temperature warnings, but you may not want to rely on those. Other than that, you have the battery serial number and the cycle count, so you can see how many charge cycles are on the battery. The next setting is the auxiliary LED, and that's the LED on the underside of the drone. When it's in auto, it will turn on when taking off and landing in low light. From here, you can also manually turn the light on, which makes the drone easy to spot when it's dark, and you can also turn it off so it won't turn on automatically. I usually leave it in auto, but you can also set it to one of the customizable buttons, which you'll see in the control settings. Moving on, the next section is Unlock Geozone. If you go into here, it will just display any unlocking licenses you have registered. I have none, so there's nothing to display. If you actually want to unlock Geozones, you'll have to go to the DJI Fly website to submit a request. Under that is the Find My Drone option, and if I tap on it, it brings up the map and I can see the last known location of the drone. And if you're still connected, you can also turn on flashing and beeping to make it easier to find. I don't have any other maps installed, so Use Other Maps doesn't do anything. And there's also this video icon. By tapping on that, it will play a 10-second clip of the camera view prior to disconnecting or before entering this option, which could help identify the location of the drone. Now, the last section under safety is the advanced safety settings. In here, you have the very important signal loss setting. This is what the drone will do when it loses signal. I almost always have this set to return to home, but maybe if I was flying in a tight space where I could lose connection, I'd want it set to hover. It will ask you to confirm before changing, so you don't change it by accident. But I can't see a situation where I'd ever want it to just descend. Really, anytime I've lost signal with it set to return to home, I've just waited a minute or so and it comes back into range. Now, below that is emergency propeller stop. So by moving the control sticks as shown below, the propellers will stop. So I have this set to emergency only, which I understand means this only works when the drone is not flying. But you can change it to any time if for some reason you wanted to, but I'll leave it on emergency only. Now, there's one more setting down at the bottom, and this allows you to turn off the vision positioning and obstacle sensing. So basically, your obstacle avoidance is turned off, but the drone also will not automatically decelerate when descending close to the ground. You do get a warning when you disable it, but I'll just show you if I take the drone up a bit and descend towards the ground, it would not stop me from slamming into the ground. So I like to keep that one on. And that's all of the settings under the safety tab. So I'll just go back up to the top, and I'm just going to switch my obstacle avoidance to bypass where I mainly keep it. And then I'll tap on the control tab to get into the control settings. The first setting is the displayed units. So this is where you select the units that are displayed on the screen and in the menus. Currently I have metric meters selected, but notice when I change it to metric kilometers, only the speed indication changes. The height and distance are still displayed in meters. And if I change it to imperial, the speed is displayed in miles per hour and the distance and height are in feet. Now, before I get to the next option, I just want to scroll down to this recenter gimbal. And I can select this to either lower the gimbal or recenter it depending on its current position. So since it's facing down, if I tap on it, the gimbal raises back to the center position. I typically wouldn't use this, but since I was here and needed to raise the gimbal, I thought I would show it. So now, to demonstrate the next setting, which is subject scanning, I will need to get the drone and gimbal repositioned so I can see myself in the camera view. Once I have that done, I can go into the settings, and now if I enable subject scanning, you'll see a green icon with a plus sign appears on me. Now, I can tap on the icon to select myself as the subject, and that opens the tracking options. Now, with spotlight selected, if I move around, the drone stays where it is, and just adjust the camera view to keep the subject, which is me, in the center of the shot. Now, if I select active shots, I get a sub-menu with 3 options. Currently, manual is selected, so if I tap go, I now get this trace wheel in the lower left corner. And by dragging this icon around, I can adjust how the drone tracks me. There are some additional settings for this that we'll have a look at shortly, but I'm going to hit stop so I can show the other modes. I'll select active shots again, and this time I'll set it to parallel. So as I move, the drone will follow me, moving parallel to my movement and keeping me in the center of the shot. Now, to switch modes, I don't have to press stop. So I can tap on auto and it will switch to auto. Now in auto, the drone will automatically perform a series of movements around the subject, and the movement is indicated up above. So currently the drone is in a hold pattern, and then you'll see it automatically switches to helix. But I'm going to stop this since there isn't much room for the drone to be flying around in auto. Now, the last tracking mode is point of interest. First, I want to reposition the drone a bit better. And now, when I select POI, I get these arrows that allow me to set the direction and speed for the POI. So first, if I drag it to the left, just not too much, you'll see it indicates slow. And if I tap on go, it will slowly start to orbit me in a clockwise motion. Now, I'll stop that, and I'll go back into POI, and this time I'll drag the slider to the right and a bit further until it shows fast. Now if I tap go, the drone will orbit counterclockwise and at a faster speed. Again, I'll just stop it before it crashes into the trees. So I'm just going to bring the drone a bit closer to myself. And if I tap on the green X, it will cancel the subject selection. Now, if you didn't have subject tracking turned on, you can always select a subject by dragging your finger on the screen to draw a box around your subject. Now, I'll just cancel that and go back into the settings. I'm just going to disable subject scanning, and then I'll go into the Smartshot settings. These are the ones I mentioned while demonstrating active shots. So depending on your subject, you have settings for person or vehicle. I have person selected, so let's have a look at that. Now, the diagram shows the inner and outer circle we've seen on the trace wheel. And below, you can adjust the radius of the inner and outer circle by sliding these markers to the desired setting. Below that, you can also adjust the height of the inner and outer circle, which is the height the drone will maintain above the subject. You can also select normal or fast for the camera motion, and you can enable or disable near ground flight, which allows the drone to descend below 2 meters when tracking a subject. And then at the bottom, you can tap on Reset Smartshot Settings, and if you select Reset, this will reset the settings for both subject types back to default. Now, I'll just go back to the top and select Vehicle. And really, you only have one setting in here, and that's the camera motion. So I'll get out of here, and the next selection is Gain and Expo Tuning. I'll select it to get into the settings, and you'll see there are settings for all 3 flight modes. So you'll first want to select the flight mode up above, and this will display the current settings for that mode and allow you to make adjustments to them. For now, I'll just leave it in normal and go through the settings. So the top settings are the maximum speeds, and by moving the sliders, you can set the maximum horizontal ascent and descent speeds. And this is the max speed when the control stick is moved to the full input in that direction. Now, I find the default settings for these are fine for most of the things I'm doing. Now, if I scroll down, the next setting is max angular velocity, and I like to have this set fairly low, at least for normal and city mode. This is how fast the drone rotates when given the yaw input, and I never want the drone rotating too fast when capturing a shot. So just to show you the difference, I'll take the drone up a bit higher, and I'll set the max angular velocity to the highest setting. Now, I can still get the drone to rotate somewhat smoothly, but if I give too much input on the control stick, it starts moving way too fast. So now I'll drop the setting way down, closer to where I would normally have it set. And now I have much better control of the rotation. And it will still rotate quite fast if I give it full input. Now I'll come back down closer to myself so you can see what I'm doing for this next setting. So I'm just going to demonstrate the yaw smoothness. And basically, the higher the setting, the longer the drone takes to stop rotating when the control input is taken away. So I'll set this to the max setting, and then I'll give full yaw input on the controller. I'll hold it till the drone is facing me, and then I'll release the control, and you can see how far the drone continues to rotate after I've let off the controls. Now, if I set this to the minimum value, you'll see the drone now stops very abruptly when the control input is removed. So generally, I set this quite low. I don't want it to stop immediately, but I also don't want the controls to feel too spongy. Now below that is a similar setting, brake sensitivity, except it determines how fast the drone will stop from a forward or reverse input. And I'll quickly demonstrate this one as well. So first, I'll set the brake sensitivity to the lowest setting. Then I'll fly the drone toward me, and I'll lift my hand off the controller to show when I release the input, and you'll see how long it takes the drone to come to a stop. Now I'll go back into the settings and change it to the highest setting. Then I'll repeat the test. Now, the higher value should cause the drone to come to a stop in a shorter distance. Really, I don't notice a huge difference, and I've always left this at the default setting of 100. And now that brings me to the Expo settings. So I'm going to try and explain these as simple as possible. To start, there are 3 curves shown, and the color corresponds to the setting with the same color dot to the right. Now, you can't see the green curve because it's behind the blue curve, but each of these settings on the right correspond to a specific stick movement on the controller. So if you're using the default stick configuration, mode 2, the up-down setting is for the up and down on the left stick, the yaw is left and right on the left stick, and the pitch roll is left and right on the right stick. And what the curve basically shows is the sensitivity of the stick movements from a neutral position to full input. So the x-axis corresponds to the stick movement, and the y-axis corresponds to the output signal to the drone. So because these curves are somewhat flat in the center, when you first start to move the stick, the output to the drone is very little, but as you move it further, the output starts to increase faster, and once the stick input is at 100%, the output to the drone will be 100%. So to help show how this works, if I were to set the yaw to 0.5, now it's a straight line at a 45-degree angle, which means the control is linear, and that the output to the drone will always equal the input on the stick. So if I move the stick 25%, the output to the drone is 25%. Now, if you look at the pitch roll curve, which is flatter in the center, if I move the stick 25%, the output to the drone may only be 10 or 15%. Now, no matter what the setting, 0 is always 0 and 100% is always 100%. The Expo setting just changes the relation between the stick movement and the output to the drone between 0 and 100%. So after explaining all of that, for the type of flying I'm doing with this drone, I find the default settings work pretty good. I think you want a bit of Expo on all the controls just so they're less sensitive right at the center to help smooth out those fine adjustments. Now, below the Expo tuning, the last 2 settings are for the gimbal. So the first adjusts the maximum tilt speed. I like to set this one fairly low, at least for normal and cine mode. Otherwise, I find it hard to get smooth gimbal movements. But just to show you the difference in the settings, I'll first leave the setting where it is, and I'll move the gimbal up and down. Now, even at full input on the dial, the gimbal doesn't move very fast. So now I'll go back into the settings and I'll change the max speed to the highest value. And now when I move the gimbal up and down, it moves quite fast. So I'll leave that setting where it is because it'll help me demonstrate the next setting, which is tilt smoothness. Now, this is much like the yaw smoothness, except on the gimbal. I'll normally have this set somewhere in the middle, but for this demonstration, I'll first set it to the maximum value, and then I'll raise and lower the gimbal and take my hand off the controller so you can see how long it takes the gimbal to stop. Now, if I change the setting to the lowest value, like the yaw smoothness, the gimbal stops quite abruptly when I remove the input. So typically, I will have the max gimbal tilt speed set quite low and the tilt smoothness set somewhere in the middle. Now, right at the bottom, you can tap on Reset Current Settings, and this will reset the current flight mode settings back to default. And that's all the gain and expo settings. Now, if I go back up to the top, I can select the different flight modes to separately adjust their settings, but each flight mode has the same settings, so there's no need to go through all of them. So I'll just get out of here. Now, the next setting is Gimbal Mode. I almost always have this set to follow mode. In this mode, the gimbal will maintain a level horizon, even as the drone tilts from side to side. But if I were to switch it to FPV mode, now the gimbal follows the movement of the drone, so as I fly forward and turn the drone back and forth, the drone banks from side to side, and the horizon also tilts, giving that FPV feel. Anyway, that's FPV mode. Now I'll switch it back to follow mode, and I'll go to the next selection, which is gimbal calibration. If you go into here, you can do an auto calibration, or you can calibrate the gimbal manually. Either way, you need to have the drone on a level surface. So I'll get out of this, and the next setting is stick mode. Mode 2 is the default, and that's what I use. This is totally user preference. If you look at the diagrams, it shows you what each stick movement does, and there are 3 preset modes to select from. So I can tap on one of the other modes, and I'll get this warning, but if I select OK, now my controls have changed to mode 3, which is basically mode 2 with the stick controls swapped. Now, if you want to create your own stick mode, you can go into custom and select manual, and by dragging the controls around, you can create a custom setup. But I'll just exit out of here and change my stick controls back to mode 2. Now, below stick mode, we have button customization. So if I go into that, I get this screen that shows all the customizable button options. So on the RC2 controller, you have the C1 and C2 buttons and the right dial, plus a combination of the right dial and the C1 and C2 buttons. Now, to set the function of a particular button, dial, or button dial combination, you just tap on the current selection to the right of the button description. That will bring up the available selections for that button or button combination. So if I select the C1 options, you'll notice there are 3 tabs at the top: Control, Camera, and Other. The Control tab is currently selected, and it is only available for the C1 and C2 buttons. And in here, you have things like Gimbal Tilt, so pressing the button will tilt the gimbal down or recenter it. The Gimbal Mode allows you to switch between follow and FPV mode. The auxiliary light allows you to switch between auto, on, and off. Cruise Control is a feature that allows you to lock the current control stick inputs. And down at the bottom, Vision Assist allows you to toggle the Vision Assist display on and off. Now, under the Camera tab, you have things like Auto Exposure Lock, EV Increase and Decrease. You can set a button to bring up the camera settings and switch between Portrait and Landscape mode. Now, all of these functions are easily accessible from the main screen, so I don't see much use in setting them to a customizable button. And under the Other tab, you only have one selection: Plan Waypoint Flight. And this just allows you to open waypoints, which once again, you can do right from the main screen, so I don't see much use in using it either. Now, if I go into the C2 button options, you'll see they're all the same as the C1 button, so this gives you some flexibility. Now, if I go into the right dial options, you'll see there are only 2 tabs: Camera and Other. And in fact, there's nothing under Other, so you really only have Camera. So with the right dial, you can set it to zoom in and out, adjust focal length, which just switches between zoom settings like 1 times, 2 times, etc. So you're probably better off just using zoom in and out. You can also adjust the EV, shutter speed, and ISO. Personally, I set all of these things right from the screen, so leaving it on zoom works for me. Now, like I said, there's nothing under Other, and if I go into the combination options, with the right dial and the C1 or C2 buttons, you have all the same selections as you do with the right dial. And then up in the top right corner, if you tap on Reset, you can reset the button functions back to default. Tap on Reset to confirm, or cancel like I'm going to do. And that's it for button customization. So I'll go back to the main settings, and the next selection is RC Calibration. This is something you should get a system notification if it's required, but you can calibrate the RC from here as long as the drone is not connected. And below that is Flight Tutorial. By going into here, you can go through a 10-minute flight tutorial. And then at the very bottom, you can repair to the aircraft if it's not connected. And that's everything under the control settings, so I'll just scroll back up to the top and then select the Camera tab. So first off, under the camera settings, the top section will change depending on whether you're in video mode or photo mode. Currently I'm in video mode, so you'll see the video format displayed. Below that is the color options, so you can select between normal, which is 8-bit color, and what I typically use, Then you have HLG, or hybrid log gamma, which is basically a 10-bit HDR format. And then you have D-Log M. If you select this, you get a new option, this color assist display. I'll first turn it off so you can see what the D-Log footage looks like. You'll see it's a flatter color profile, which allows the camera to record more dynamic range, but you'll have to color grade this footage. Now I can switch on the display assist, and it will adjust the controller display to look more like what you're actually seeing. Now, if I switch the color back to normal, I get two options for coding format. H.264 is an older format but has better compatibility with all devices and platforms, whereas H.265 is newer and supposedly better but has some compatibility issues. Now, HLG and D-Log M are only available with H.265. Now, this next option, if you have this turned on, you'll get these SRT files with your video files, and these are subtitles that contain telemetry information. So, in your video player, if you turn on subtitles and select the SRT file, it will overlay this telemetry info over the video, and you can see there's a lot of data displayed that you can see in real time. Alright, before I go on to the rest of the settings, I'll switch the camera mode so you can see the settings available in photo mode. Now at the top, you can select your photo mode. I typically have JPEG and RAW selected, that way I get both, but it does take more memory and the RAW files need to be color graded, whereas the JPEG files I find in most cases are more than sufficient. Now below that is aspect ratio. If you want to use the entire sensor on the camera, you'll need to select 4:3. But if you just want 16:9, you can select that. And the last setting is resolution. I think the quality of the 12 megapixel photos are quite good, but if you want the highest resolution, say for printing photos, you can select 48 megapixels, but the files will be larger. Alright, now we get into the general camera settings. And the first one is anti-flicker. I normally just leave this in auto. When enabled, it's supposed to reduce flicker in the footage caused by unnatural light sources. Below that is the histogram, and I always have this on. It's a great tool for monitoring your overall exposure. So when I turn it on, you'll see the histogram appear on the left side of the screen. And the idea is you want the majority of the graph to be centered in the display. So if I bring the exposure value down, you'll see the graph shifts to the left. And then if I turn the exposure value up, the graph shifts to the right. And basically, that's all you need to know about the histogram. So if I go back into the settings, the next option is peaking level. So if you're using manual focus and peaking level is turned on, objects in focus will be outlined in red. And the higher the peaking level, the thicker the outline. So I'll first set it to low and turn on manual focus. And now you'll see most of the objects are somewhat outlined in red, because the manual focus is set to far away and there's nothing really close up. Now, just to show you the other settings, I'll go back and switch the peaking level to high. And now basically everything is red. So I'll change it back to normal. And now if I start to adjust the focus closer, you'll see the red mostly disappears because the objects are now out of focus. So this can be a handy tool when using manual focus. Okay, I'm going to turn that off. And then the next option is the overexposure warning. And I like to have this on because it lets you know if parts of your shot are overexposed. So if I turn it on, right away you won't see much difference. But if I start to increase the exposure, you'll see black and white stripes start to appear in the sky. That's the overexposure warning. So normally if you are capturing footage and you have these overexposure warnings, you can decrease the exposure to correct it. Now the next setting is grid lines, and there are 3 different displays you can select. When selected, the grid will be shown on the camera view display. So I'll turn on the first one, which has diagonal lines intersecting at the center of the frame. And I often use this one for keeping a subject centered while doing an orbit type shot. Now, if I go back into the settings and turn on the next one, you get this thirds grid. And this I use all the time for shot composition. And then the last one is this center point. And I don't use it as often as I prefer the diagonal lines. So I'm just going to turn all of those off for now, as well as the exposure warning, because I don't want a bunch of stuff on the screen. Now, the next setting is the frame guide. This is not something I've ever used, but if you select it, you get a choice of 2 aspect ratios. And if I turn one of them on, I get this overlay on the screen, which doesn't affect the footage, but it allows you to see what's in the frame if you were capturing footage for that particular aspect ratio. Now, the next setting is white balance. And if I put it in manual, I get this slider to adjust the white balance so I can make the image cooler or warmer by dragging the slider back and forth. Anyway, I'll set it back into auto, and that's where I normally leave it. But sometimes I'll switch it to manual just while I capture a shot so it's not changing. Now, below that, you have this style parameter, and by tapping on it, you get 2 selections. You can adjust the sharpness and noise reduction. The default for these is 0, and with that, the drone is going to apply some adjustment to the sharpness and noise reduction. Now, if you want to turn either of those off, you can set them to -2. Or you could increase them if you want more adjustment applied to your footage. But I'll just set them back to 0 because the default works fine for me. Now, below that, you can see your available storage and choose your current storage location. As well, you have the option to format your memory card from here. Now, down from that, you have some custom naming options. So if you tap on the first one, custom folder naming, you can create a custom folder where the files will be stored. And if you go into the custom file naming option, you can enter a custom file naming format. These aren't something I've used, but some people may find these handy. Now, the next setting allows you to enable or disable the cache when recording option. When enabled, the live view in the controller will be stored in the controller memory when recording. And below that, you can set the maximum memory available for video cache. And down at the very bottom, you have this option to reset the camera parameters. So if you tap on it, you get this confirmation that the settings will be reset to default. You can tap on confirm if you want to reset, but I'll cancel out of this. And that's it for the camera settings. The next tab is transmission, and I'll select it, but there's not much that I'm doing in here. At the top, there's a selection for Livestream platforms, and if you go into it, you can select a platform for broadcasting the camera view. This is not something I've tried or even know much about. And the same goes for the frequency and channel mode settings. I haven't had any issues with the current settings, so I leave them alone. And the last tab is the About tab. And this is basically where you can get a bunch of information on the drone as well as check for updates. At the top, you can also enter a name for the drone and its Wi-Fi name. Below that, there's the aircraft model, the Fly app version, aircraft firmware, and the RC firmware. And if you're connected to Wi-Fi, you can check for firmware updates by tapping on Check for Updates. Now, down a bit further, you have the current version of FlySafe data, and here again you can check for updates. And then down at the bottom, you have the serial numbers for all of your equipment. There's also a selection to reset all settings and clear all data. The reset all settings will reset everything in the safety, control, and camera settings to default. And I believe the clear all data clears the flight data, but I haven't used either of these. Now, the last thing to do is return to home. And I've moved from the original home point, so I'll need to update the home point. And I said earlier in the video, I'd come back to this. So I'll just go back into the safety settings and go into update home point. Now you can see it doesn't actually show the current home point. It shows it next to the drone indicator because that's what's selected in the upper right corner. But if I drag the map around, I can reposition the home point wherever I want. But I want to set it where I am, so I can select the controller icon in the upper right corner. And now the home point shows next to the controller indication, which is where I want it, so I can select OK to update the home point. Once I get the home point updated message, now I can initiate the return to home. And that's it for all the main menu settings. I know it was a long one, and if you made it all the way to the end, that's awesome. Thank you. And I hope you found it very helpful. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one.